Hello. The past two stories in this series have been interesting just for how outrageous or sad they can get. Today's subject is no different, between a long streak of DNQs and merging with one of the most famous teams in racing history to no increase in success. Forty crashed and burned. SimTech tried to do everything right and was struck down by the hand of God in the process. The story that doesn't fit either of these extremes is Pacific. Pacific Racing was a wildly successful name through the lower formula before making the jump to F1. The team was established in Snetterton in 1984 by former driver and engineer Keith Wiggins, and with the help of financial backing from Marlboro, found immediate success in Formula Ford with Harold Heisman. After Heisman left to drive in Formula 3, he hired Bertrand Gachot, the Belgian born in Luxembourg, formerly imprisoned in Britain, who raced under a French racing license. He also won the Formula Ford title. His successor was J.J. Leto, and he won the Formula Ford Championship too. They made the jump to British F3 in 1988 with Leto in tow, and they won the title in their first attempt. They immediately left to Formula 3000, keeping Leto and signing Eddie Irvine to drive their second car. Instead of hopping onto the scene and Brock Lesnaring themselves to the front of the field like usual, they took a bit to get hot, not winning a driver's title until 1991 with Christian Fittipaldi. Their final year was 1993, where they just barely missed out on winning the title. With a driver history of Bertrand Gachot, J.J. Leto, Alan McNish, Marco Greco, Eddie Irvine, Christian Fittipaldi, Laurent Aiello, and David Coulthard under their belt, you can safely say that Mr. Wiggins here had a hell of an eye for talent, and his track record of winning championships speaks for itself. Everything he had touched turned to solid gold, so the natural course of action for 1992 was taking that final step up the ladder and entering the pinnacle of European motorsport, Formula One. Wiggins changed the name from Pacific Racing to Pacific Grand Prix and started putting things in place for a bid into F1. His first move for entry in 1992 was proposing a partnership with Tyrrell, but that fell through. He waited another year, and in his first attempt at riding solo, he had spent about $1 million and had even gotten as far as an engine deal with Cosworth, but then Black Wednesday happened, checks started bouncing, and Wiggins decided to back out, focusing on the F3000 team full-time again. Come 1994, though, they had no obstructions. They signed an engine deal with Ilmor to run the engines that March and Tyrrell ran in 1992, and they contacted their longtime F3000 chassis supplier Reynard to build their chassis for them, as they had attempted to field a team of their own before. Unfortunately, the team that had worked on that program, headed by Rory Byrne, had left Reynard for Benetton in 1991, and they had sold their blueprints for that design to Ligier. Reynard still built a new chassis from scratch, and what resulted was the Pacific PR01, one of the few cars for 1994 that had a raised nose cone. Only Benetton shared this design, which it doesn't necessarily take the likes of Cole Phelps, Colombo, or Amelia Watson to figure out why that's the case. The first driver they brought on board as a driver and shareholder was our old friend Bertrand Gachot, getting what was likely his last chance at Formula One. The second driver that bought his way into the team instead of being hired was Paul Belmondo, son of famous French actor Jean-Paul Belmondo and former boyfriend of Princess Stephanie of Monaco. He had previously raced for March, but was sacked halfway through the season because, well, he wasn't necessarily good. It's safe to say this move was made solely for financial purposes. Their test driver was promising prospect Oliver Gavin. The team hadn't even gotten to the first race before problems began to arise. There were issues with installing the Ilmor engines, and if they ever got them to work, they would never work for too long before grenading. The chassis also sucked. Reports from Gavin and Gachot stated that it had the structural integrity of a wet paper bag, and it didn't handle well in the slightest. Gachot managed to put the car on the grid for the season opener in Interlagos, beating David Brabham's SimTech, but Belmondo couldn't set a time at all. Gachot wrecked out on lap 3, but even still, they put in more mileage during this race weekend than they did throughout the entirety of preseason testing. That's a damning statement. Okayama would be a taste of the weeks to come, as neither car would make the grid. Gachot would miss out by a half a second, and Belmondo was half a second behind that. It was at this point that Keith Wiggins probably realized it would take a massive amount of improvement to get the car on the grid, at least in a normal year. It wouldn't come as a surprise to you that 1994 was, in fact, not a normal year. After first practice at San Marino, it was evident that at least one Pacific car would make the grid. Not on merit, though. Rubens Barrichello had been injured in a horrifying crash at the Variante Bassa chicane, and his entry was withdrawn from the race. In qualifying, Gasho stuck the car in 25th ahead of Roland Ratzenberger, but then, Roland had his massive accident in the Villeneuve kink, which unfortunately took his life. Belmondo had earlier set a time that was 27th fastest, and due to Ratzenberger's passing, he could have taken that spot, but Belmondo himself declined, stating that he didn't deserve it. He didn't set a time fast enough. At Monaco, both Williams and Simtek ran one car in respect to the two drivers they had lost in the previous race weekend, so both Pacifics were guaranteed a spot on the grid. Their grid positions got 2 places better after Sauber withdrew in the wake of Karl Wendlinger's crash at the Nouvelle chicane that put him into a coma. Gasho retired on lap 49 with a gearbox issue, and Belmondo retired the car 4 laps later due to what was put down in the record books as physical exhaustion. Belmondo himself testified that his arm had a cramp and then went numb. Ouch. Sauber ran with just Heinz-Harald Frentzen at Catalunya, so there was a guarantee that at least one Pacific would make the grid. Andrea Montermini in the Simtek had originally outqualified Belmondo, but then he injured his foot in the second qualifying session and missed the race, so both cars made the grid. This would be the last time that would happen. Belmondo spun off 2 laps into the race, and Gasho retired after his rear wing broke. Sauber got a replacement in Andrea de Cesaris, but Simtek ran with one car once more in Montreal. Gasho got in, Belmondo did not. Gasho retired on lap 47 due to an engine failure. Simtek replaced Montermini with Jean-Marc Gounon for the French GP, bringing the driver total back up to 28, which would not change for the remainder of the season. Pacific would not make another race. Both Gasho and Belmondo would set the 27th and 28th fastest times 10 weeks in a row, from Magny-Cours all the way to Adelaide. Even abandoning the raised nose cone for a more traditional design couldn't help them make the grid. On good days, Berto was within a second of 26th, but more often than not, it wasn't even close. The most damning indictment of the PR01's performance was Gasho being outqualified by Taki Inoue's Simtek by 1.3 seconds, even when Taki was over 3 seconds slower than 25th place Mika Salo. It was a streak of futility that had not been seen since Eurobrun's full year of DNQs in 1989. Gasho even said to the press at Adelaide that Saturday qualifying was the happiest day of his life because he never had to drive that godforsaken car ever again. It was a total nightmare of a season. "1995 would be a totally clean slate. Pacific had forged a partnership with the recently departed Team Lotus, which, it's hard to tell what that partnership really did. There wasn't any technology, staff, or equipment transferred over, so what was the point? Anyhow, Wiggins hired an entirely new design team for their new car, the PR02. It certainly looks like an average Formula 1 car, until you look at the nose. They had mounted the front wing in the middle of the nose cone, and what was left was just a slab of white, and it is ugly. McLaren also tried a mid-wing design using their 1995 entry, and while the raised nose design does it more justice, it doesn't look very aesthetically pleasing. Berto was retained to drive one car, and they traded Belmondo for Andrea Montermini. 1995 was going to be, by default, a better year, as they had a guaranteed spot in the field. Lotus and LaRousse had left, and only Forti had entered in its place, so nobody would bump the 2 cars off the grid. In their first race start since July of 1994, Gasho retired with a gearbox failure, and Montermini would finish the race in 9th. Not bad, all things considered. They would then double DNF twice in a row, Montermini wouldn't start the race in Spain, get disqualified at Monaco for failing to serve a stop-go penalty, and then not get classified in Magny-Cours after being lapped 10 times. Gasho stepped away from driving duties after the British Grand Prix, and he was replaced by Italian nobleman Giovanni Lavaggi. He got his start in racing at the age of 26, without his family's help, and had a respectable track record in sports cars before buying his way into Pacific. At the age of 37, he was the second oldest driver to make his debut in F1 since 1977. His expectations were through the floor, and somehow he still couldn't clear them. In the 4 races he attempted, he was anywhere from 8 to 12 seconds slower than pole, and he never finished. After he ran out of money, he left the team. He would then move on to drive for Minardi the next year. You would think that Pacific would want to avoid that embarrassment again and go for someone that has some experience and pace to replace him, but nope, they signed the other of the 2 slowest drivers of all time, Jean-Denis Delatraz, a man that Jonathan Palmer once said on national television had no right to be in Formula 1. In his debut at Estoril, he was 12.2 seconds slower than pole, and 5.2 seconds slower than 23rd place Roberto Moreno in the 14. At the next race in the Nürburgring, he qualified 9 seconds off the pace, and he gave us one of the funniest clips in F1 history. Delatraz's antics even got Murray Walker, the consummate professional that he is, to loudly ask on air what the fuck he was doing. Watch this.
He got through. Niki Lauda on the right, Jean Todt in the background. And what is Delatraz doing? Doesn't matter what he's doing, he's got a Lacey and Schumacher.
Who allowed this? Who put this guy behind the wheel of a race car? And to make it even worse, he then immediately defaulted on a payment and left the team. Watching him race in Formula 1 has condemned me to never being able to talk bad about the likes of Pastor Maldonado ever again. Gasho was brought back to see out the rest of the season, and he scored an 8th place finish at the season finale when they then finally, mercifully, ran out of money. Wiggins pulled out of Formula 1 to focus back up on F3000 for 1996, where he just could never catch that lightning in a bottle ever again. The team finally shut down in 1997. Alright, with all of that out of the way, how do you think it would have gone down in a parallel universe? Let's back it up. I don't think there's any stopping the train of misery for Pacific in 1994, but the main thing that changes is up at the front of the grid. In the Benetton camp, JJ Leto has his testing accident before the season that messes up his neck, and instead of trying to rush his way back into the seat, where he promptly messes up his neck a second time, he asks for his release from Benetton so he can properly recover from his injuries, and also win at Le Mans. Jos Verstappen participates in the whole season as Michael Schumacher's wingman. For the 1995 season, Pacific goes full clean slate. The design team that built the car from the previous season is given the boot, and a new, more competent team is hired in its place. On the engine front, Pacific parlays their deal with Ilmor in 1994 into a works deal with Mercedes for 95, as they were now free after their deal with Sauber wrapped up. With McLaren also getting Mercedes engines, Pacific enters a kind of partnership with them. Essentially, they become to McLaren what Simtek became to Benetton in the previous video. They share tech, they share staff, they share equipment, and both sides benefit from the Mercedes powertrains. Gasho is retained to drive one car, and the other is filled by a Mercedes works driver. In a last chance you type of move, Bernd Schneider, fresh off a lot of success in DTM, is given one last shot in F1. Gasho has a strong showing, more reliably finishing races inside the top 10 and even scoring points in the more casualty-ridden races such as Hockenheim and Silverstone, but Schneider struggles. He rarely finishes races, let alone finishes in the points. Practice sessions are filled with images of his car facing the wrong way or stuck in the sand traps and grass. After 12 races, he leaves the team on amicable terms to return to touring cars, and his replacement is an old friend of the team. Welcome back to Formula 1, JJ Leto. Riding the wave of winning at Le Mans, he puts together respectable finishes until the end of the year. In 1996, Gasho steps back from driving duties, and their test driver, Oliver Gavin, gets his big break in F1. The combo of Gavin and Leto cements itself firmly in the mid-pack, scoring plenty of points. It's at this point that Pacific begins to evolve into a true B team for McLaren. Their test drivers begin to have links to both McLaren and Mercedes, or even hail from the McLaren Young Driver program, and over the years, they start to take seats in F1. In this universe, Pacific houses the formative years of drivers such as Oliver Gavin, Nick Heidfeld, Ricardo Zonta, and, on a long enough timeline, even Lewis Hamilton and Kevin Magnussen. Alright, let's move on to the credits. Keith Wiggins would buy up the remains of Tony Bettenhausen's kart team after a plane crash took the life of Tony and a few executives. The new HVM Racing would have moderate success, being co-owned by Paul Stoddart and Cedric the Entertainer at one point before Indy reunified, giving Wiggins the distinction of being one of 3 people that have owned and operated an F1, kart, and IRL team. Bertrand Gachot would do a whole lot of nothing after Pacific went under, retiring from racing in 1997. In retirement, he is now the CEO of an energy drink brand. His daughter is now a pop star. No, I'm not making any of this up. Paul Belmondo would own and operate his own racing team in the endurance scene, which participated in the World GT Championship and Le Mans Endurance Series until it folded in 2007. His best finish in the 24 Hours of Le Mans is 3rd in his class, 22nd outright in 2005. Andrea Montermini, after finishing the Simtech Pacific 40 Shuffle, my favorite dance move, would do kart stuff until 1999, and then sports car competition into the present day. We've already gone over this. After his time at Minardi ended, Giovanni Lavaggi would found his own racing team, Scuderia Lavaggi, and start constructing endurance cars. While there are countless instances of owner-drivers in racing history, he is the only example of a constructor-driver in racing history. He retired from racing in 2018. Jean-Denis Delatraz became a star in the sports car scene, winning 9 races in the FIA GT Championship and winning his class twice at Le Mans in 2001 and 2002. His son Louis is currently racing in IMSA and the European Le Mans Series. Oliver Gavin would never get his shot in F1, but he would become the safety car driver from 97 to 99, and then spend 12 years making the American Le Mans Series his bitch. Captain Corvette would win the Petite Le Mans 5 times, the actual Le Mans 5 times, and the 24 Hours of Sebring 5 times, racking up 3 championships in Alms, which would have been at least 5 had they had a Drivers' Championship in 2004 and 2005. He may be British, but his efforts to make the Corvette a feared force in GT racing makes him an American hero to me. And so that marks the end of Pacific Racing's time in Formula 1. They had stormed through the lower formula, but once they had reached the top, they ran out of steam. Their streak of futility through the second half of 1994 hasn't been seen since. Thank you for watching. In the coming weeks, I'm going to tie everything together with a long what-if situation combining all 3 what-if scenarios together. I'll see you then.